Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to Voluntaryist Academy. My name is James Cordiner. Last we left with this series was quite some time ago, but we left off with pretty much talking about Josiah Warren and his efforts with the New Harmony, outpost, town, whatever, and his basic life and everything like that. It's been a while. I've been trying to get back to this, and I finally just managed to just say, you know what, I'm going to do that tonight. I'm going to do that live right now. And this is Men Against the State, the expositors of individualist anarchism in America from 1827 to 1908 by James J. Martin. This is a crucial piece of work to digest in order to understand this time period, the attitude toward government by these abolitionists, and the general, theme of, individualist anarchism, and where these principles stem from, the type of people that were the philosophers that were behind it, and how it's kind of been carried on as a tradition even into the modern day by many, many, many brilliant and bright philosophers of the modern day, enlightened thinkers of the modern day even. So without any further ado, we'll just get right back to the presentation. This is chapter 2, titled Spring Hill, Tuscarawas, and the New Harmony Interlude. Okay, so the attempt to start a mutualist community in New York in 1830 died while still being contemplated. Robert Dale Owen was delayed in returning from England by the death of a relative, and activity failed to occur in his absence. Since the movement had been predicated on aid from him, all hope from that quarter vanished, Warren commented cryptically. And why Owen did not support this unusual and exciting social adventure at a later time continues to be obscure. He never explained his loss of interest, and Warren's silence as to the particulars was typical of his refusal to conduct extended postmortems upon experiencing rebuffs and failures, which grew in number from this time onward. So this is Josiah Warren that we're talking about. It is true that he was somewhat disappointed in his Cincinnati friends, who interpreted the sudden halt as the result of the realization of the advisability of the village as a mechanism for making quote-unquote profits. The lack of faith was a source of irritation, but the loss of support was deemed preferable to the risk of inaccurate printing of his communications by the newspapers. Distrust of the public press became one of Warren's lifetime obsessions, but he continued to explain his economic views in the Free Inquirer. He now said, for the first time, that production should be regulated by demand in the equitable villages, that wear and tear of tools and machinery should be figured into the prices of the finished articles as so much labor consumed in their production, and that the freedom of access to craftsman techniques would result in a type of society in which the harshness of the competitive processes would be immeasurably softened. Warren insisted that public opinion of the group of cooperators would establish a price for each article of commerce on the basis of the average number of hours expended in its production, with the attempt constantly being made to reduce this estimate as proficiency in production increased. Thus, he argued, if the labor price of a pair of shoes was estimated by his hypothetical community at 10 hours, and one shoemaker succeeded in making a pair in 6 hours, which compared with the average in quality, he would thus receive 10 hours of labor on his behalf for his 6. In like manner, the less skillful shoemaker who was able to produce a pair in no less than 12 hours would thus be forced to exchange 12 hours for 10. So this is basically like a salary. This sounds to me like a description of a salary. You work, you get paid salary, 60 hours a week. You could be called in, and when I was working in kitchens, there were guys that were working salary, but they'd get paid 50 hours a week for 50 hours a week, and they'd end up working 60, 62 hours during the week. So, but that's a different, but anyways, I'm sure you guys can understand where I'm coming from and understand this. So moving on. Since this was obviously uneconomic in his particular case, it was essential that complete freedom to experiment in other occupations was be provided. Until the person in question succeeded in developing skill in a trade or occupation which permitted him to maintain his position on an equitable basis within the group. This simple economic doctrine formed the basis of Warren's attack upon the apprentice system, which he claimed produced monopolies of skills and encouraged a vicious, unnatural kind of competition. These and other particulars of his equal exchange of labor teachings appeared in various New York newspapers during this period of inaction. Restless and disillusioned by the lack of substantial aid from Owen, Warren left New York in August 1830 and made his way back to Ohio. Here he renewed his former associations and friendships in social action. An interesting interlude now transpired, during which the practical aspects of cooperative labor exchange received their first test under community conditions. In May of this same year, while on his way to New York, he had become acquainted with a curious little group located at Spring Hill, just beyond Massillon, Ohio. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Rough around the edges here, folks. Welcome to Voluntaryist Academy. Stick around. In January 1829, a group of 5 men under the leadership of Samuel Underhill had begun a small manual training school there, which included a community of property arrangement for the 25 children under their care. The men were veterans of 3 Owenite colonies and recently had separated from that at Kendall, a few miles to the east on the outskirts of Canton. A year and a half before, the death of a Quaker lady named Charity Roch had placed at their disposal the interest from a sum of $22,000 previously set aside for this purpose by her, for the benefit of an undesignated number of quote-unquote poor children. The bequest provided that the income of the communal school was to be augmented by the proceeds derived from the sale of the products of these children, who were, strangely enough, besides being required to attend school from 3 to 4 hours daily, made subject to a possible workday of an additional 8 hours. Okay, so we might be noticing a lot of footnotes that I'm skipping over at voluntaryistacademy.com. Rest assured, there's a copy of this very PDF that you can download if you just go to the resources page, voluntaryistacademy.com. Warren found this small group of men busily engaged with the boys and girls, all between the ages of 10 and 16. The school was in the 5th month of its 2nd year at the time of his visit. The situation of the orphan children in the new environment delighted and surprised him. To him, it was proof of Owen's theories in the most decisive manner. A subsequent dispatch printed in the Free Inquirer contained the following observations. I saw children who, a little more than a year before, were destitute orphans and who, might have been, shut up in a house of correction, a house of refuge, or some other monument of human ignorance, now living as happy as they could well be. I saw young females who, had they been in the cities, would have been compelled to waste away in unremitting toil at their needles for 12.5 cents a day, or to drag out a monotonous life of enervating servitude in the kitchens of the rich. I saw them here comparatively independent and daily acquiring an education, which would enable them to supply their own wants and conduct their own affairs. The boys had acquired a practical knowledge of agriculture, and the girls of housewifery and domestic economy. And so, despite the functioning of the communal school and the existing commitment to continue the venture under this arrangement for 2 more years, Underhill and his associates listened sympathetically to Warren's proposal to change the basis of the economic activities to one of individualism, featuring the cooperation and cost price elements which he had developed in his Cincinnati store, which we went over in part 1. Link in the show notes. It was to this little group of acquaintances that Warren returned, remaining for the better part of a year. During this period, several elements of the labor exchange plan were worked out. Along with the introduction of labor notes and a variety of activities, Warren reported satisfactory results in the new attack on apprenticeships. 12 persons were reported to have learned to make shoes successfully in less than a month. Warren himself learned to make wagon wheels in 5 days. He also conducted a music school for 20 children upon the labor exchange idea, the pupils paying their share of 2-hour lessons with their own labor notes for 6 minutes of their own time. At the same time, investigations were carried on in learning the intricacies of ironworking, spinning machinery, printing, typecasting, and house construction in attempts to learn how soon the mastery of the skills involved could be done. This investigation continued into other activities which were considered vital to the beginning of an individualist colony without outside aid. Warren insisting that, quote, the movement must be carried on by those who have nothing but their hands, their time, and their necessities, end quote. At this same time, Warren began his experiments with vocational training for children, seeking, among other things, to convert young people into productive members of the community in as short a time as possible while avoiding injurious and artificial influences. He was convinced that the apprentice system and unequal pay for children either resulted in exploiting young people or in confining them to a parasitical existence in the interest of eliminating pressure for jobs. He sought to remedy in placing boys of 11 or 12 years of age upon their own resources, assuring them a full return for their efforts, and giving them full responsibility over their own activities and decisions. He insisted that admission of the young to adult circles, in economic matters at least, could begin much earlier than usually supposed, without any element of exploitative paternalism generally associated with child labor within the family group. He insisted also that the usual position of relationships be reversed in teaching trades, and that the pupil pay his instructor according to the time of the latter, which was actually spent teaching the trade in question. He says, Warren says, when we admit the rights of children, Warren declared, and acknowledge that there is no equitable ground of demands upon them, only as equivalents for what they receive of us, and set an example which it would be safe and legitimate for them to follow out toward us. This, then, is education, end quote. Acquaintance with the realities of life at an early age would provide an understanding of the law of self-preservation. Assurance that all exertion would be followed by a commensurate benefit or gratification would supply incentive or motivation for the assumption of independence in economic matters. All other approaches to child control, including demands for the practice of self-denial and arbitrary compliance to parental command, Warren deplored as a double-standard selfishness and the wielding of false power, quote-unquote false power, over one's child delegated by, quote-unquote ignorant lawmakers. The stories of a number of boys placed on the new equitable relations at Spring Hill were related by Warren, including that of the son of the director, who succeeded in making a pair of shoes for himself in less than 2 days, and continued in this capacity until the need of the community for other shoes had been fully supplied. Within a period of less than 3 years, then, a number of the elements of a non-exploitive economic self-sufficiency had been tried out. 1, the cost basis of price. 2, the cooperative nature of production and with provision for the individual responsibility in the matter of both quantity and quality. And 3, the problem of artificial restraints on production, represented by the apprenticeship system and the educational structure. When one includes Warren's stand on money and land with these matters, it can be seen that the logical extension of these economic doctrines led to a rejection of the state. But such considerations were not of particular concern at this time. Later exponents of anti-statism recognized this repeatedly. When the state's function in protecting the economic and social structure of society came under direct fire, and when the term anarchism had begun to be used to designate opposition to institutional government. Okay, so the decision to delay the formation of a full-fledged mutualist colony until the termination of the Spring Hill Contract, which was not scheduled until 1833, brought about Warren's discussion of the political character of equity and its collision with the existing order of things. Having become convinced that the silence of the newspapers at the time of his 1827 Times store had been due to deference to the pressure of their merchant advertisers, he carried the fight into a new area. He succeeded in developing a cheap modified proof press, which, when used in conjunction with the ingenious stereotyping invention, not only drew repeated attention in New York, but enabled him to become a publisher and delineator of his own brand of radicalism. Quote, "Printing is a power that governs the destinies of mankind," declared Warren in 1830. To continue, those who can control the printing press can control their fellow creatures, end quote. The step from inventor to that of pioneer anarchist pamphleteer was no longer difficult to make. Warren's time for the next 2 years was taken up by a variety of activities. He returned to Cincinnati, attempted to market his new press, and formed a small group for the purpose of discussing and studying the social questions which he now challenged. His former associate, John Pickering, became a prominent supporter at this time. Spirited arguments took place relative to the merits of quote-unquote equitable commerce, a number of which were admitted to be highly critical, although the nature of the criticism was never made known by Warren until in his printed works. Of his activities in the Cincinnati cholera epidemic of 1832, little is known beyond the fragmentary reminiscence of his son over 60 years later. In January 1833, the first issue of the Peaceful Revolutionist appeared. Warren had previously confined his attentions to economic matters, concentrating on principles which tended to promote the survival of a cooperative group within the state, but ignoring its processes. Now he engaged in vigorous criticisms of political and philosophical content, buttressing his rebels' approach by a serious study of Alexander Bryan Johnson's pioneer work on semantics, called A Treatise on Language, or Treatise on Language. He made use of the current national crisis, especially the proposed Georgia General Convention of the States and the nullification controversy, to serve as illustrations in championing his brand of individualism as the correct foundation of social organization, at the same time delivering a blast at government and law as agencies utilizing coercive authority derived solely from majority sanction. Government and law, argued Warren, were merely forms of language, not material things, and as such were by their nature subject to an innumerable variety of different definitions, constructions, and applications. It was unrealistic for the Georgia legislature to become disturbed by quote-unquote conflicting interests, which had recently gained national prominence. They were but a natural consequence of assumed powers resulting from confused concepts of law and government. Continuing along the line of abstract semantic analysis and ignoring the impact of ideological acceptance, which made discussion of such nature real to the general public, Warren made light of nullification as he brusquely interpreted the whole matter as a quarrel between, quote, dignity and liberty, one a shadow and the other a ghost, end quote. In Warren's writings, dignity insists upon it that the laws shall be obeyed and that the union must be preserved. But these two words, must and shall, rouse the ghost of murdered liberty to resistance. Dignity abandons the real subject of dispute and resolves the whole matter into a mystical reverence for the two words union and laws. I say for two words because if we look for their meaning, we find, as in all other words of a general and indefinite character, there are very few, if any, who will agree in their manner of applying them. If the word law has ever meant one thing more than another, that thing has been the will of those in power. Having made this stark observation, he went on to say that union, in the sense of a similarity of interests, feelings, objectives, mutual assistance, and quote-unquote cooperating action, had never existed except in time of grave peril. The nearest thing to such a state of affairs had been present only at the time of the Revolution, a matter of reality and not mere verbalism. Since the Union then had been a creature of circumstances, the fight for separation from England, it should have ceased at the termination of the struggle. The subsequent compact of union, quote unquote, however, he considered an incomprehensible something into which our ancestors had been betrayed. It required all to register similarity in thought and action without reason to demand or power to compel. If a universally held sentiment of any kind prevailed at all, Warren persisted, it was the desire to be free to differ from others, for which the existing framework of government made no provision. Without respect for the right to disassociate, non-coercive preservation of the Union was an impossibility. Warren's unqualified attachment to the exchange of equivalents at or near labor cost put him on the side of the South, at least in the matter of economics. A tariff was a most invasive act, little better than thievery on a genteel, white-collar level. Opposition to collection of a portion of a neighbor's property to pay for services neither received nor desired became a traditional anarchist policy in later years. Yeah, that's taxation. Let's read that one again. Opposition to collection of a portion of a neighbor's property to pay for services neither received nor desired became a traditional anarchist policy in later years. Taxation is not just theft, folks. It is slavery. Those are my words. That's what I'm saying to you right now. That's the new slogan of Voluntaryist Academy. Taxation is not just theft. It is slavery. Its earliest statement by Warren was brought out by the circumstances attending the resistance by South Carolina to imposition and collection of duties by the federal government. Warren ignored the political and personal issues involved and blamed the business system for the origin and spread of the tariff as idea and as policy. He indicted foreign and domestic capitalists for having precipitated the controversy, including the waste of money involved in the possible provocation of a civil war, the thought of which he abhorred. Warren's position was more than a criticism of the protection of infant industry tariff argument. His solution consisted in the adoption of the non-profit labor exchange. Had it prevailed from early times, the cooperating interests essential to national goodwill would have been produced, and, quote, it would have swept away the whole foundation of the tariff and all the enormous expenses of time and money, and the difficulties and disaster of which the subject has been or may be the cause, end quote. That's from The Peaceful Revolutionist, which is one of Warren's multiple essays published February 5th, 1833. The prophetic flavor of this latter remark gives evidence of some acquaintance with the nature of the national unrest which had been quietly brewing since the time of the Missouri Compromise, even though Warren never showed understanding or sympathy for the representative government along constitutional lines. Okay, so just a brief aside again, anyone not familiar with what the Missouri Compromise was, there was enough territory to make a state called Missouri. For many, many years at this point, there was a state in the north being thrown around. They were trying to make Maine an actual state, but the delegates, the people from the South, the delegates from the South refused to recognize or ratify the state of Maine because it would have made the North have more states than the South. And then when the Missouri territory came around and they were trying to form the state of Missouri, this is the Missouri Compromise. The North gets Maine, the South gets Missouri. That way the balance of anti-slavery states and pro-slavery states stayed, kind of harmonious. So that's the basics of the Missouri Compromise. Very, very basics, which is more than enough to get you started on your own research into it. Okay, so even though Warren never showed it, despite an attempt at simplification of a complex problem by the substitution of a decentralized economy, he was aware of the weight of the forces of opposition to any adjustment of society on such radical lines as he suggested. These forces he saw buried within the structure of the state, sheltered by the bulwark of statute law. Henceforth, the concept of the state and state-made law came in for increasing criticism. He concluded that individuals rather than law were the vital agency in governing under any legal system, due to the importance of interpretation by administrators. Quote, every election illustrates this, Warren expostulated. We are told that our destinies depend on the election of this or that man to office. Why? This shows that it is men and not laws or principles that govern society. Okay, end quote. The making of laws one year and their repeal the next, the reversals of judges and juries upon identical cases, all this was evidence enough to show, he thought, that there was no security in law and that it must be sought elsewhere. The wild fluctuation of legislation and the political intrigue associated with the public land controversy convinced him that laws and governments were public means for use as private ends. Warren challenged the right of the state to grant land titles. Such action was little more than official interference directly resulting in the creation of special privileges. So Warren wrote, the greatest crime which can be committed against society and which causes poverty and lays the foundation of almost all other crimes is the monopoly of the soil. This has not only been permitted but protected or perpetrated by every government of modern times up to the last accounts of the Congress of the United States, from the Congress of the United States. Yeesh. Punishment to continue with the book, punishment of crimes against property in such situations was grave injustice. Yet it was in this manner that the people's money continued to be spent in the enforcement of legislation by delegated authority. The legislators themselves, he argued, should be subject to severe penalties as well as having acted in the above capacity, if consistency was to be preserved in this matter. An expression of anti-state sentiments on still another current issue appeared in the pages of Warren's pioneer publication. This was the matter of projected government aid to the establishment of public schools. His philosophy of education, based on the results of Spring Hill experiences and his experiments in his own family, inclined him strongly toward individualism and decentralized power in matters of education. Such a background made him unusually sensitive toward political influence in the educational structure. Quote, the power of educating the rising generation is of too much importance to be trusted in a manageable shape in the hands of any small body of men, as society is now constituted, end quote. That is also from the pages of The Peaceful Revolutionist, this time published April 5th, 1833, series of essays, The Peaceful Revolutionist. Having botched the land and tariff questions, there was little hope that lawmakers would prevent education from becoming another stronghold of irregularities. What's up, mandatory myocarditis? I see you in the chat, bro. See you there. Welcome, welcome. Stressing that, so he was fearful that, well, he was concerned that that there would be no consistency in the education, it sounds like to me. He's stressing the need of placing young people on their own responsibilities at as early an age as possible. His object was to make them productive members of the community and reduce potential parasitism to a minimum. It was not strange to hear such a philosophy in a frontier environment not yet complicated by the problem of widespread use of labor-saving machinery and the ever-widening pools of unemployed, which featured the swings of business cycles of the following century. So there's something interesting about this Warren's involvement with the Owens out in New Harmony. There's a book by Murray Rothbard, which I have here. Let me turn around, I'll grab it real quick. Or at least I think real quick. Hold on. Anyways, not as quick as I wanted to, but it's we went over it on the channel. We did the first half of it on the channel before. Education Free and Compulsory by Murray Rothbard. And there's a section of the book where Rothbard talks about this this Owenite community out in New Harmony, and I think we're going to go over that at some point too, just as like a cross reference to what's being talked about in this book. So anyways, this has been on my mind when it comes to, Robert Owen in New Harmony. There's a lot with the public education system that starts out in Ohio. There's pamphlets that are printed and exchanged, brought to other states. Anyways, long story short, there's more to this community than meets the eye, but this is Warren's involvement in that community. It's not about that community particularly. So where was I? It was not strange to hear such a philosophy in a frontier environment not yet complicated by the problem of widespread use of labor-saving machinery and the ever-widening pools of unemployed, which featured the swings of the business cycles of the following century. And it held that children should be paid on the same level as adults for production of comparable quantity and quality. This would encourage independence and seriously weaken the base upon which exploitation of child labor rested, he felt sure. The proverbial resistance of children to formal education would become a memory if placed upon their own resources and forced by experience to learn the consequences of inaction or inertia. Self-dependence would actually increase the desire for instruction. Schools in his social scheme existed to make children expertly acquainted with the techniques of making a living, as well as providing them with the rudiments of a cultural background. Warren criticized as deplorable and unnecessary the use of arbitrarily inflicted punishments and the customary repressions of the school system. Quote, "The natural rewards and punishments of their conduct I consider the only species of government that does not produce more evil than good," end quote. And that was also from Peaceful Revolutionist from April 5th, 1833. Such was the simple solution to the problem of inducting the young within the loose structure of the mutualist community sketched by its first prominent exponent in America. The opportunity to observe these fundamentals in practice on the community level had finally arrived, moreover. The contract of the Quaker Manual Training School had expired the month Warren's publishing venture began, thus releasing the members for a new experiment in community life. Warren understood the necessity of starting the adventure in individualist voluntarism in fresh circumstances, which made the acquisition of land in a relatively isolated area imperative. A tract of 400 acres was selected and purchased in Tuscarawas County, which became the site of the first anarchist community in America, years before anything similar was attempted in Europe. Again, years before anything similar was attempted in Europe. You Perdone lovers out there. Warren himself was there intermittently at the start. The original group on the grounds consisting of only 6 families. The first few dwellings erected by the cooperators made use of the labor for labor principle. A few weeks later, a steam sawmill was erected and operated on a mutual basis, another unprecedented innovation. What's up, Michael? Michael Acapulco says, hell yes. And I say hell yes right back to Michael. Thanks for being here. This was an imperfectly worked out trial, a partial answer to Warren's approach to capital in the form of one of the means of production, and in some degree indicates the reason for the limited appeal of his views on such matters to those who heard them propounded. Sounds to me like they were setting up quite the agorist kind of society, labor for labor, mutual exchange, all operating off the sounds to me like, like the principles of natural law, do it because it's right to do. There's also some pressure from the environment back then where, they mentioned earlier, the law of self-preservation kicks in and you want this thing to succeed. Well, you got to get on board and be a team player. Yeah. Okay. There's a reason why it's called the law of self-preservation. It's a natural law. It doesn't go away. We don't want to live there, of course, but there's more to life than just self-preservation. But we don't want to squander this thing either. We don't want to just throw this thing away, do we? This beautiful thing called life. To continue, it had been decided at a meeting at Spring Hill in February 1831 that all capital to be invested in the mill was to be obtained through voluntary contribution, and such persons were to understand that there was to be no return in the form of interest. Warren insisted that the persons compromising the investors, apparently the majority of the members of the community, were to be free at all times to withdraw their capital, but admitted that such action would seriously embarrass the operations projected. Despite such weakness of structure, it is evident that it served its principal purpose, the supplying of lumber for the constructing of houses at an unusually cheap price as compared to prevailing rates in the surrounding countryside. No explanation was made as to how the approximate labor cost of a product resulting from the applied efforts of several persons was tabulated. Modern critics of the Warren approach profess inability to reconcile it with the complexities furnished by present-day assembly line production, with its blending of productive tasks in an overall social function, for example. With reference to Tuscarawas, this account of the labor exchange, for all you audio listeners only, that's spelled Tuscarawas, Tuscarawas. Spelling bee champion. All right, so Tuscarawas, this account of the labor exchange in practice is lost. In other particulars, the village realized the aspirations of community life with a maximum of individual freedom and lacking an elected officialdom, but it was not destined to succeed. Unlike the majority of the communities of the time, Tuscarawas declined for other than economic reasons. Faulty judgment had resulted in locating the settlement on land in a low-lying area, which subjected the residents to a variety of illnesses. The principal one, judging from a description of its symptoms, was malaria, endemic in the river valleys of the Old Northwest at this time and extending as far north as Detroit. By the end of the first summer, half the adults were incapacitated, and most of the activities of the group had come to a standstill. Despite the grave concern now over the location, the company agreed to try a second year, which proved disastrous. Prostrations from disease increased, culminating in an epidemic of influenza during the winter of 1834, which spread death among some 30 families. The result was the abandonment of the first equity village early in 1835, in the face of difficulties produced by natural forces beyond the control of the settlers. It was a painful decision to make in view of the otherwise successful operations. Warren left the site before the remainder of the company, some of whom lingered in the vicinity for another 2 years. The fact that the colony represented their entire wealth invested in land and buildings made it especially difficult for some to leave. Complete removal, made ultimately at a staggering loss, was not done until 1837. Despite the abortive character of Tuscarawas, the band of Warrenites taking part in its founding made discoveries which had lasting influence. A brand of community life based on voluntary assent and lacking the formalities of a majority rule was entertained without calamity or social chaos. You see, the extreme reverence for individuality in all aspects of social life, an impossibility in the highly centralized urban life of the country 2 generations later, was modified in accordance with the Warrenite concept of the labor cost theory. It is true that the equitists realized the deleterious effects which monopoly operations of machinery was capable of having on the labor cost exchanges, but under practical conditions, neither the finding of the labor cost price of products or of social effort nor separation of capital interests took place. Yet this did not result in any irreconcilable situation. Tuscarawas became an inspiration rather than a source of dismay to Josiah Warren and his associates. The intention of trying once more had been voiced repeatedly before dispersal took place. The time and place were to be determined when a sufficient amount of capital had once more been accumulated. The anarchist character of Warren's objective continued to be negative. No intent to overthrow any existing order ever became part of his strategy. Compared to the propaganda on the grand scale of the European school, his objectives were excessively modest. He built simply upon the assertion of the possibility of economic survival of the small, self-sufficient community within the structure of the state, complemented by determination to ignore all institutions of the latter in a passive manner when they were not founded so as to respect individual sovereignty and voluntary cooperation. Enthusiasm and conviction notwithstanding, community activity along individualist lines ceased for over 10 years after the final dissolution of Tuscarawas. The intervention of 2 unexpected developments helped postpone this matter, contributing to the shifting of Warren's attention elsewhere temporarily. One of these was the business and financial panic of 1837, and the other, the meteoric rise and spread of the joint stock associationism of Charles Fourier, which dominated the persons with a bent for community joining for the next decade. Both factors tended to inhibit individualist community attempts, although they stimulated individualist literature of notable quality. Warren regarded the Fourierite association as little more than a resurgency of the Owenite community of property. Nevertheless, he expressed great admiration for the energetic propagation of its basic ideas. In fact, he ascribed part of his inability to further his own ideas as due to devotion of Fourierite propagandists. These French, I can't, I'm going to try. I'm going to push through. We're doing it live. He ascribed part of his inability to further his own ideas as due to the devotion of the Fourierite propagandists, observing with ill-concealed satisfaction at a later time that the rapid abandonment of the great majority of the phalanxes contributed to a revived interest in the quote-unquote equitable commerce. Conflicting accounts are responsible for the lack of accurate information concerning Warren from the time of his removal from the scene at Tuscarawas. The next 12 years comprise a feverish record of constant moving, inventions, spasmodic publishing, and further minor social and economic experimentation. Leaving Cincinnati once more, he returned to New Harmony, the scene of his introduction to the heady brew of societary reconstruction. The first few years found him concerned with the problems of making a living in an economy demoralized by the reigning panic and depression. The family had hardly settled down in New Harmony when the urge to continue work on a printing press of unorthodox construction found him returning to Cincinnati in the spring of 1839. In about 8 months, he perfected and constructed a new quote-unquote high-speed press, printing from continuous rolls of paper at a rate of 3,000 to 4,000 impressions an hour, an achievement previously unheard of in the Northwest country, and unmatched except by the most advanced innovations in printing which were coming into use in the urban East. Although not a true web press, the speed of the new machine caused consternation among the printers of Evansville, where it was taken after completion to be used in the publication of the Southwestern Sentinel. Warren, thinking along coastlines, figured he had produced an instrument of benefaction, but for the first time collided with the phenomenon of sabotage, a growing weapon of labor in fighting monopolistic control and manipulation of labor-saving machinery. Returning once more to New Harmony, he found himself called repeatedly to Evansville to repair calculated breakdowns. This continued for about 2 years, following which he dismantled the machine and brought it to New Harmony, where he used part of it himself in his own printing operations. Warren found New Harmony apathetic to his labor exchange program. 10 years had brought about numerous changes in attitudes among several segments of the town's population, including a merchant landowning circle of individuals who by this time had become conservative. These persons were especially opposed to any tampering with prevailing attitudes, and their first efforts inhibited most of the proposals intended to demonstrate the principles of equity. His attempts to conduct a manual training academy, or as he styled it, a, quote, labor for labor seminary, was effectively scuttled. After operating for a few months early in 1840, it was scuttled. Public lectures on the subject, delivered in the Rapite Community House No. 1 during March of the same year, brought concerted opposition from the local merchants when it became known that a revival of the Times store had been freely and favorably discussed. Discouraged by the show of opposition which closed the town to his ideas and by the lack of aid in any substantial form, he again journeyed into Ohio, lecturing in Cincinnati and the vicinity. While here, utilizing his skill in printing and his new press, he brought out another short-lived anarchist periodical called the Herald of Equity in February of 1841. Once more, he doggedly attacked the conventional methods of exchange and expounded the labor cost principle in a form which appeared practically unaltered in all subsequent native anarchist economic writing. Warren insisted that society no longer could entertain the identification of cost with value. The two terms had no common denominator. Quote, value to the receiver is an unjust, a false standard of price, he said. The idea that the price of an object was what it would bring on the market, he called, quote unquote, the pitfall of the working classes. When coupled to the accepted relation of supply and demand, this merely created a state of, quote unquote, civilized cannibalism. The most successful speculator, conscious of maximum want, was enabled to practice a type of scientific extortion upon the community. Using gross extremes, for example, he was completely at a loss to find justification for this device. For instance, what was the price of a loaf of bread to a starving man when taken from the standpoint of need? Attempting to inject humanitarianism into economics, Warren could find nothing suggesting justice in such or similar situations, unless it be based on his ubiquitous exchange of equivalent amount of labor time spent in production. By this time, the element of repugnance as a factor in determining labor time had entered the picture. This, along with the relative intensity of the industry involved, perennial vexations to labor cost, the theorists had been encountered at Tuscarawas and became items of concern as time went on. When it came to the matter of the utilization of labor currency as the circulating medium, Warren, with a sense of grim satisfaction, saw it as a principle leading eventually in the elimination of two pet grievances: banks and bankers. Quote, all money and banknotes, as now known and used, act as drafts or demands upon labor, and they are all issued by those who do not labor, end quote, he angrily declaimed. Convinced that bankers performed no functions serving the wants of group living, no possible manner in which they or any other, quote unquote, non-productive elements of, quote unquote, society might share in the productions of labor presented itself to him. In this starkly materialistic conception, the doctrine of equitable labor exchange confined control of its exchange medium to the participating members exclusively. Although it remained for later associates to more fully expand the indictment of banking as a consciously created and protected monopoly of the state, the Warren condemnation contained the core of anarchist sentiment. When viewed against the backdrop of distress occasioned by the panic and controversy over the rechartering of the United States Bank, the notorious corruption associated with the wildcat banks, and the intensified shortage of credit existing, it is probable that Warren was speaking for more than people of his own particular convictions. Mid-November 1841 found Warren back in New Harmony. The 7 years since Tuscarawas had not erased his enthusiasm for new experiments in cooperative economy. Man, is this guy relentless. I like the cut of his jib. The relative improvement of his fortunes by this time, reinforced by the unsubstantiated belief that the attraction toward Fourierism, had declined among those of the general public who still had hopes for economic reform, combined to encourage once more a quote-unquote plunge into the arena, as he dramatically described the decision to operate another time store. The resistance of the merchants to the establishment of a store selling at near cost price again made its appearance, but only partial success attended their efforts this time. Lectures in the surrounding countryside had their effect, and encouraged by support from several sources within the town, Warren spent the winter of 1841 to 1842 preparing to open the store. Stocked with the usual staples at the start, obtained primarily from Cincinnati wholesale dealers, the New Harmony Time Store opened for business on March 22nd, 1842. Unable to obtain access to property in the town proper, the venture was located approximately half a mile south on the Mount Vernon Road. Again, the customers took part in the voluntary labor for labor exchange, making use of the familiar labor note currency. The drastic cuts in prices attracted a widely scattered patronage, some of the participants coming from points as far as 100 miles away from New Harmony. And sounds popular. In view of the discussion provoked by the functioning of the labor exchange in Tuscarawas, they're now entered into the issue of labor currency, the matter of intensity of work, and also the further qualifying circumstance of previous training, which for the first time was considered a legitimate portion of the cost of labor. As in Cincinnati, each individual decided the value of his own labor note. The expectation being that the general opinion of the people involved in the labor exchange would eventually set an average for the various products and services in terms of labor price. The matter of depreciation and possible non-redemptions, the former the result of overissue, were more theoretical than actual weaknesses, even if there were instances of both. Warren said that counterfeit currency and bank failures caused far more losses than unredeemed and overissued labor notes. In several cases, the labor notes assumed a degree of validity to him which surpassed his faith in the nation's currency. While in New York, 16 years later, he admitted having New Harmony labor notes, accepted in 1842 for several types of services, which he firmly believed would be honored even then, had he cared to present them for redemption. Talk about a store of value. Despite the fact that such notes might present no danger of depreciation, the promise to furnish a specified amount of time in some occupation over sustained periods of time was predicated upon the physical ability and willingness to perform when the note was presented. Labor currency, like other types involving the element of faith, was not able to completely escape the psychological difficulty created by the operation of ideological and moral issues upon otherwise mechanical factors. Josiah Warren's second-time store created a memorable impression upon the town of New Harmony. The impact of the new rock-bottom pricing on the credit structure erected by the local merchants was disastrous, but even more ominous in the eyes of the orthodox were the bi-monthly discussions of the affairs of the labor exchange participants in the once forbidden Rapide Community House No. 1, an affair which promised to undermine the local retail situation even more. It was no more the intention to disrupt the economic order of New Harmony than it had been in Cincinnati a decade and a half before. But for the second time, Warren had to bow before the Warren had to bow before the expedient use of his methods by a group which understood the immediate results of such a system, but preferred to ignore the original impulse responsible for it in the first place. Warren once more admitted failure after having demonstrated on the simplest practical level in the hopes of setting up in the nearby area another equitable colony. No newspapers in the area risked the wrath of advertisers to print his few communications, and the entire affair was shunned by the prominent residents of the town. A pair of small periodicals called the Gazette of Equitable Commerce, which he put out, and The Problem Solved, an effort of an associate, Thomas Varney, both failed. Warren recalled that the former acquired only 4 subscribers in the 2 years of operation. Man. As a result, he found that the quote-unquote community people of New Harmony were not interested in his activities other than taking advantage of their effectiveness against the incipient local monopolies of their own merchants. Poor fella. Favorable reports on the soundness of the store notwithstanding, its doors closed in March of 1844, and the attempt to found a mutualist community in the environs of New Harmony was slowly strangled by apathy. If the Owenite communities of property disintegrated as a result of indecision after a brief period of great promise, a parallel can be seen in the dissipation of Warrenism in hesitancy and inaction. The time store idea persevered, however. A small number of farmers and local workers of scanty means felt its loss severely at this time and agitated for the beginning of another. The mid-40s were still opportune times for the rebirth of the old community ideas and the intellectual radicalism usually attending their discussion. Robert Owen had returned to the old haunts in October of 1844, just at the height of the feverish political campaign which saw his son, Robert Dale, waging a successful fight for re-election to the United States House of Representatives. The cause of the respectable liberals in New Harmony and vicinity found expression in the pages of Alexander Burns Jr.'s Indiana Statesman, which devoted most of its pages to castigations of Henry Clay and the Whigs of Posey County, which carefully sidestepping Warren's perturbing doctrines. The uncomfortable slavery and land reform issues fared no better, however, even though dispatches from sundry reform papers sometimes obtained brief recognition in the exchanges. Despite the unceasing propaganda for his own reform interests, the champion of mutualism sided wholeheartedly with the local affiliates of George Henry Evans and their campaign for free homesteads and limitations on the ownership of land. Although his principal objective in starting the time store had been the destruction of the credit system, which he decried as, quote-unquote, the monstrous second feudalism, the loss of lands as the result of tax delinquency was a cause of much apprehension on his part, as well as distress in the county. Although he never joined the Free Land Association, having rejected political action, his efforts as a printer were at their disposal as a means of reaching the public. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that Warren's last bid for support among New Harmony's radicals in the early months of 1847 was hardly noticed. Impressed by the enthusiasm of Evans and Louis Mascarier and the bright promises reflected in the pages of Young America, the erstwhile sympathizers of cooperative colonization had now placed their hopes in the quest of free land through political pressure. With the aid of a handful of supporters, Warren resolutely went about acquiring land around his previous time store. A third time store began retailing goods there on February 16th of 1847. The labor note system went into use at the same time, accompanied by ambitious plans for the sale of lots to potential settlers who, in the aggregate, were to comprise what he whimsically referred to as, quote-unquote, the village. Plans were completed for a 20th anniversary convention on the grounds on May 18th to celebrate the opening of the first time store in Cincinnati. But doubt as to the possible survival value of this last effort began to assail him before the winter was over, and he decided to sell his interests in the ill-fated trial before it was hardly more than 2 months old. On this wavering note, the period of social experimentation in New Harmony ended, almost 2 decades after the dissolution of the parent inspiration of the entire impulse. The expectation of outside aid, especially from the Owens, was no longer in consideration. The patriarch of New Lanark saw little hope in colonization schemes except as they might be based on religious grounds. The Shaker settlement at New Lebanon, Pennsylvania, seemed to point the way to him in the late fall of 1845. On the other hand, his son, erstwhile associate of Francis Wright and friend of a dozen reform movements, immersed now in Indiana and national politics, continued in cordial terms with Warren, but his interest in the latter's social experimentation no longer prevailed. A more practical phase of Warren's activity now furnished the attraction to Owen, his never-ceasing researches and the fundamentals of printing. Turning from presses to typefaces, he brought out 2 small volumes in 1844, which made use of a revived interest in an early 18th century stereotyping process. This involved the substitution of a composition of unusual hardness in the place of metal, which reduced printing costs markedly and furthered the contest with publishers in general. These pioneer booklets, which sought to revolutionize the system of musical notation and thereby enabled aspiring musicians to reduce the expense and duration of training, met no better fate than any of his other earlier accomplishments, other than to further the development of what he later designated as universal typography. Warren compromised his principles in respect to previous unyielding theoretical opposition to patents. At the urging of Owen's sons and his old friend, the Midwestern scientific agricultural pioneer Solon Robinson, the process was patented in the spring of 1845. Robinson not only brought the documents to the patent office at this time, but acted as agent for Warren. While traveling through the Midwest, he publicized its merits, which were recognized by editors with whom he came in contact all along the Ohio. The inventor himself illustrated his ability as an engraver with numerous examples of his artistry, several of which embellished the heretofore stark pages of New Harmony's weekly journal. Regardless of the patent protection and the attendant publicity, no attempt was made to plumb the commercial possibilities of the composition cast method of stereotyping. To Warren, it meant more as an opportunity to expand his own printing activities, especially in broadcasting the message of equitable commerce, since he had contemplated for some time publishing a comprehensive summary of his philosophy and explorations in social matters. It now was possible to fulfill these aspirations with a minimum of expense. Despite the interruptions caused by the handicaps of working without help in an endeavor with the benefits of division of labor were obvious, the work persevered. The difficulties were not all mechanical. Warren was not a literary man and wrote painfully, in a simple but often stilted style, which was further burdened by a somewhat archaic vocabulary, even in the estimate of his contemporaries. The final product of 2 years of collation and revision of a mass of notes taken sporadically for almost 20 years, all its imperfections considered, was a document of undeniable simplicity. Published in April 1847, Josiah Warren's Equitable Commerce became the first important publication of anarchist doctrine in America, and with minor deletions, additions, and revisions, went into more editions within the next 30 years than any other product of native anarchist thought to this time. Equitable Commerce, as an expression of social discontent, catches much of the flavor of the worldwide revolt sentiment in the mid-19th century. In an apocalyptic discourse reminiscent of, but anticipating Marx's Communist Manifesto, Warren also looked out upon a civilization approaching a revolutionary crisis, but with the battle lines being drawn on a broad parasite producer rather than the more limited capitalist industrial worker line. Warren writes, "Society has been in a state of violence, a revolution of revolution and suffering, ever since its first formation. And at this time, at this moment, the greatest number are about to array themselves against the smaller, who have, by some subtle and hidden means, lived luxuriously upon their labor without rendering an equivalent. Governments have lost their powers of governing by their own operations. Laws have become powerless from the inherent defectiveness and their... hold on one second. Their inherent defectiveness and their iniquitous perversions. The grinding power of capital is everywhere felt to be irresistible by the ordinary means. The right of the strongest begins to be openly admitted to a frightful extent, and many of the best minds look forward to an age of confusion and violence with the confidence of despair. The cry of misery and the call for remedy are heard from all quarters. The Warrenite program, okay, so to continue. The Warrenite program, however, discarded familiar reform interpretations and solutions. All varieties of collectivism, paternalism, violent revolutionary, and political action. Elaborating on some of the ideas already expressed in other writings and further confirmed by experience and convictions produced thereby, he launched a delineation of the individualist stand on the proper reward of labor, security of personal property, and freedom of the individual. Summed up in two slogans, quote, sovereignty of the individual, end quote, and, quote, cost the limit of price, end quote. Equitable commerce concentrated on preparing a case for this kind of individualism. The brief in the absolute inviolability of the individual personality expressed in its pages placed him in a camp opposite from the advocates of reform through legislation or violence. In Warren's estimation, liberty and security were complementary, not opposite. Liberty was the foundation upon which security of both person and property rested. And as long as there was one insecure person, there was potential insecurity for all others. This called for location and proper relation of power, which for each individual extended over his own person and property and not beyond. So let me read that part again. Okay, because this is incredible how long this concept has really been around and has been being communicated. So I want to make sure that this really gets driven home. In Warren's estimation, liberty and security were complementary, not opposites. Liberty was the foundation upon which security of both person and property rested. And as long as there was one insecure person, there was potential insecurity for all others. This called for location and proper relation of power, which for each individual extended over his own person and property and not beyond. Wow. That was in Equitable Commerce. I mean, published in, what did we say? 50? No, it was beyond that. 1847. Anyways, to continue. This was expected to result in the undermining of all of the structure of all authority obtained from any other source than that of voluntary grant. To admit boundless individuality in nature and then to create institutions requiring agreement contrary to one's will appeared the height of contradiction. Personal differences were an inseparable part of the individual personality, which he refused to see bypassed in the quote-unquote pursuit of policy and expediency, end quote. On this basis, he rejected institutional activity, which ultimately depended upon compliance on the part of the members unable to see it conducive to their best interests to do so. Hey, what's up, Sean? Best interest to do so, or which compromised them by demanding conformity as the price for favors allegedly furnished. I mean, this is just home run stuff right here, folks. For real. This is like the whole intention of this channel, at least, in this stage of the channel, is to show all you listeners and viewers out there, like how long this stuff has been, like these principles, this philosophy has been around. The Age of Enlightenment never ended. There's not an expiration date on it. This is the continuation of it. 19th century abolitionist movements in America that extend outward, still going on today. And these philosophies, they needed polishing, and we're here to do that polishing. That's what we got to do, each one of us. In the vein of his earlier writings on law, Warren continued to castigate legislation as one aspect of this denial of individual freedom. He objected particularly to the demand of unconditional fealty from all, enthusiastic or hesitant, to the wishes of a larger number. Warren saw no virtue in majorities. To him, right was not a quantitative matter to be determined by sheer numbers. Should a thing be an evil when espoused by a few, the support of a larger number at a later time did not automatically change its nature, making what had been reprehensible now respectable and desirable. So that means that no matter how many people think that a thing is good, when that thing is actually evil by its very nature, it's not up to the majority to decide, and that morality is not relative, morality is objective, and that good and evil are objective things, and not up for us to just be like, whoa, we can just make it whatever we want. That's what he just said. Should a thing be an evil when espoused by a few, the support of a larger number at a later time did not automatically change its nature, making what had been reprehensible now respectable and desirable. He refused to consider the manipulation of verbal symbols, like laws, in the same sense. He says, Warren writes, words are the tenure by which everything is held by law, and words are subject to different interpretations according to the views, wills, or interests of the judges, juries, and other functionaries appointed to execute these laws. In this uncertainty of interpretation lies the great fundamental element of insecurity. No language is fit for any such purposes that admits of more than one individual interpretation, and none can be made to possess this necessary individuality. Therefore, no language is fit for the basis of human institutions. To possess the interpreting power of verbal institutions is to possess unlimited power. This is why I do this, folks, because that right there is just the ultimate like casting out of why man's law is so brittle and so arbitrary, is because of the vast amount of interpretations of words, and to write these things down like it's like a fool's errand. It's a boondoggle. Warren thus attached to law, by virtue of its perpetual uncertainty, the blame for the great majority of crimes. Statute law could hardly be expected to do anything except aggravate and expand the diseases of society over a larger area. Warren scorned the explanation of laws and government by political theorists who sought to relate them to reality as manifestations of a common desire for the protection of life and possessions. He refused to believe that human history revealed such realizations, and was convinced that the state had failed in its basic mission in providing protection for its citizens. What was worse, in his mind, was the effect of the governing process, which had been precipitated into a struggle for control of the governing privilege. This was the result, he explained, of the discovery that in an environment characterized by insecurity, the least insecure were the persons who were successful in obtaining control of the governing power. Oh, God. The least insecure were the persons who were successful in obtaining governing power. Thus, rulers and ruling groups, protected temporarily by virtue of holding power, punished crimes by death and imprisonment without realizing that these were consequences of their own acts. The increasing complexity of laws and lawmaking succeeded in increasing the volume of violations rather than producing the security of the society which they purported to represent. On still another level, there was the spectacle of a government involving its citizens in group responsibilities from which many may have preferred to remain apart, and in extreme situations, such as wars, compelling them to desert their own interests and even die without any recourse of any sort. Warren proposed a solution which dispensed with government other than that of each person over himself. Never shall man, to quote, never shall man know liberty until each and every individual is acknowledged to be the only legitimate sovereign of his or her person, time, and property, each living and acting at his own cost. The only ground upon which man can know liberty is that of disconnection, disunion, individuality, end quote. American radical writing has few expressions which match the determination found in this piece of anti-statist literature. Even though the complexity of human relationships in modern urban industrial society make its message of separation of interest sound of little use or pertinence. Other than this course, Warren predicted, would only increase conflicts and consequently would require more direction from the quote-unquote outside, more mediation, more intervention, which he termed government. The next part of the exposition of the ideal equitable society described the process whereby the aims of the individual and the needs of the society were to be blended. The dog-eat-dog kind of individualism Warren saw all about him caused him considerable concern. His aim was to avoid the initiative-destroying propensities of the community of property with which he was all too familiar. Keeping in mind physical and intellectual variables present among persons, he built up his version of an economy geared to a system of exchanges which used the labor cost of production as its sole guide. He proposed an economic structure consisting of producing members, acting either alone or in groups, organized entirely on the principle of voluntary cooperation to make the most from the known advantages of division of labor. In all cases, there was to be full individual responsibility, a condition to be arrived at by agreement where more than one person was involved. Only under such circumstances would it be possible for a group to live socially without the committal of powers of decision into the hands of an arbiter, judge, politician, or other representative of outside agency claiming to operate in the interests of the group, in which he included the churches. No halfway process would be of any avail, because it was impossible to surrender a definite quantity of one's liberty. It was impossible to surrender a definite quantity of one's liberty. Once erected, a government always tended to encroach upon what it did not control, due to its control over the interpretation of language which delegated the powers it first obtained. The way of life which Warren sought to inaugurate according to equitable commerce incorporated a number of considerations which were bound to make the entire project unpalatable to most of the affluent and comfortable members of society among his readers, and to all those with ambitions of carving out for themselves a higher position in the existing order. The ultimate reorganization of society on the basis of decentralized local communities in which the needs and capabilities of all might be readily learned was expected to lead to the circumvention of political boundaries and the placing of of all inter-community relations on a voluntary level as well. It was assumed that community services would be supplied in a superior manner by individuals who contracted to furnish them when called for by those who wanted and paid for such conveniences. Warren mentioned nothing concerning the problem of inter-community transportation and communication. Furthermore, this system was predicated on the theory that there was an optimum community size, following the attainment of which it was expected that additional communities would develop nearby to the parent. In developing this matter, Warren appeared to be thinking in terms of experiences of the last year at New Harmony during its Owenite phase. Although Warren appeared to be thinking in terms of the experience of the last year at New Harmony during its Owenite phase. Although Owen himself had stated before New Harmony the necessity of limiting the size of community. One of the primary requirements of the self-sufficient society was his insistence on the decentralization of manufacturers. Thank you very much. One of the primary requirements of the self-sufficient society was his insistence on the decentralization of manufacturers to be confined to the production for satisfaction of local needs exclusively. I need to drink some water. Hold on, guys. My beautiful wife got me a cup of water midstream. Thank you, beautiful wife. Among other things, this was considered beneficial in order to fix responsibility for the utility and quality of the products, which were variables over which consumers in a profit economy far removed from the site of production had practically no control. So with respect to machinery, the position taken in some ways anticipated Henry George. Warren did not look upon it as a separate factor of production, but merely a combination of the two he recognized, land or raw materials, and the labor which went into its production. The combined labor of producing the materials incorporated in the machine, in addition to that needed to construct the machine itself, equaled what he called the quote-unquote cost of the machine, and belonged to the laborers and the inventors who conceived and built it. Machinery was a social benefaction only so long as it made products available priced to consumers in terms of cost of production. The displacement of labor resulting from the introduction of machinery might seek employment in other activities not yet fully mechanized, having benefited from the cheapened product now resulting from the technological innovation. Warren looked forward to a future work day of 2 or 3 hours through the abolition of craft monopolies and the social sharing of the benefits of machine production. He did not believe that needs were indefinitely expansible, and thought that if technical production was geared to needs, there would be none of the pernicious effects of speculative manufacture with its disastrous accompaniments of overproduction and subsequent destruction for the purpose of preserving price levels. Warren's opposition to the private ownership of machinery on the basis of a patent monopoly or any other contingency except actual construction was no more resolute than his opposition to the acquisition of land for speculative purposes. While 15 years before he had questioned land titles themselves, he now was willing to accept the prevailing division, providing all land sales subsequent to the original purchase involved no addition to what he called the prime cost. The prime cost beyond expenses resulting from surveying, drawing up the contracts, and even taxes, to which there was no expression of resistance, a remarkable concession. Equitable Commerce contained the now familiar exposition of the labor note currency, with variations resulting from discrepancies which previous trial now exposed. Okay. Warren sought to solve the problem caused by the refusal of some members of his previous labor exchange to participate in accepting similar amounts of any member's time. This came as a result of his declaration that work of the greatest repugnance was worthy of the highest remuneration. Remuneration. Since distastefulness must be considered one of the elements of cost, if anyone was to perform the unpleasant tasks in a non-coercive society. It was felt that the undermining of this principle destroyed the whole basis of the labor exchange plan. Another novelty in the statement of labor notes bore on the issue created by persons with different evaluations of labor time. Although Warren had repudiated gold and silver and all other commodity-backed monies as inferior to the direct matching of labor for labor in equitable commerce, he decided that there should be an alternative to the acceptance of the actual labor of the person presenting any given note. This resulted in the concession to back the labor currency with quote-unquote Indian corn, which was judged to be superior to metals with respect to ease of determining its cost of production in man hours. All subsequent labor notes bore guarantees of payment in a number of pounds of corn. So cornback currency, cornbacks. The later, got your cornbacks. Come get your cornbacks. The latter portion of equitable commerce is devoted to a description of the steps to be taken in forming an equitist village, which Warren believed the most important part. Yet his work is best remembered as the earliest document of importance in the definition of individualist anarchism along theoretical and intellectual lines. The limited edition of this work no doubt set the boundaries of its contemporary influence, a matter which is still quite difficult to determine. Whereas the devotion to the ideal of complete individual autonomy may have struck responsive notes in a number of circles, it is doubtful if the United States of the late 1840s, with territorial expansion, war, and the slavery controversy occupying most of the stage, that there was an area of receptiveness for the supra-nationalism, the bitter institutional criticism, and the economic propositions contained in this slim volume. Warren had no intention of creating a sensational incident and a focus for violent language by placing his ideas and the results of his investigations and experiences within the perusing reach of those with polemical predispositions. The concluding pages had a note of abdication on his part in the event of such incidents, which in many ways was the index of Warren's personality and a source of criticism at a later time. Warren writes, I decline all noisy, wordy, confused, and personal controversies. This subject is presented for calm study and honest inquiry, and after having placed it fairly before the public, I shall leave it to be estimated by each individual according to the particular measure of his understanding, and shall offer no violence to his individuality by any attempt to restrain or to urge him beyond it. Far from having leisure to engage in recrimination, at the time of the book, the book was completed, he was already involved in fresh activity, preparatory to resuming community life experimentation. The resumption of relations with old acquaintances and sympathizers in the Cincinnati area gave promise of some support for the first time from enough persons to make the organization and operation of a labor exchange village more hopeful of success than ever before. Okay, So that is from Men Against the State. Oh man, my goddamn book cam froze up. God damn this. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. Does it work? Hey, yay, it works. Okay. So that's Men Against the State. Not a very big book, you know, but I got another one. Hold on. Okay, so this is a book called The Practical Anarchist. This is a book where you can find, like, pretty much, I'm pretty sure it's all of Josiah Warren's work in here. We got, if we take a look at the index, let me move my water so it doesn't spill. When we take a look at the index, or the table of contents here, not the index, excuse me, we can even see if we can get some focus here. Focus. It's not going to focus. What the fuck? Oh, that's not. Let's just do one of these. See if we can get this bad, Larry. See if we can get it to focus. Gosh. Anywho, why isn't it focusing? That's so weird. My technology is failing me right now. And anyways, in this book, The Practical Anarchist, oh, now it's focused. Maybe it's just having trouble with the small print. Maybe it's the lighting. Who cares? Anyways, let's move on. The Practical Anarchist, Crispin Sartwell. Okay. We can find in this book, let's move it up a little bit. We can find in this book the equitable commerce. We can find the, what else is in here? The Peaceful Revolutionist, which are his more important writings. And then there's a bunch of other, like, smaller, you know, essays and letters, okay, that he wrote. So I suggest getting this. This is a nice addition to the home library for any anarchist historian, maybe. And so, you know, Josiah Warren, let's talk about him for a second. Sounds like a little bit of a communist, a little bit of a socialist, doesn't he? Maybe early stage socialist. Has a lot of really great ideas, said a lot of really great things. Definitely on the side of liberty, definitely experimenting a lot and trying to figure it out, you know, like feeling his way around this philosophy that he's helping discover in real time, you know, and so, you know, he's making decent arguments. And on this philosophical stage, argument is the way we proceed, the way we move forward, the way we figure it out and get to a place, you know, where today we have a better understanding, right? So this is 170 years ago, you know, so there's been a lot of time, obviously, between then and now, where some of these ideas that Josiah Warren's philosophy at the time may have led to Karl Marx and other people, and even, you know, Proudhon and all these other, you know, anarchist philosophers. I mean, hell, like it's just really good to see the ideas being explored, and that the truths that were told in Men Against the State tonight, you know, they remain true to this day, because that's the funny thing about truth. It doesn't, you know, if something is true, it typically stays true, at least in terms of the laws of nature, natural law. You know, we might tell a story and it's true from our perspective, you know, but when it comes down to whether or not a behavior is right or wrong, well, does the nature of that behavior change? You know, can murder suddenly become right? You know, we've all pretty much agreed, well, except for the murderers out there, we all agree that murder is wrong. I mean, even some of the murderers probably think it's wrong, but they are compelled to do it nonetheless. The question remains, do those actions one day, just because enough people sit around and decide that it's okay to do that, does it really change it from being evil to good? Right from, does it really change it from being wrong to right? Just because the majority of people say? These are the questions that we need to remind ourselves to ask other people, to ask ourselves, and to, stand firm in the understanding that the answer to that question is no. No. No amount of people can go and take a behavior that is objectively wrong and make it a right. No matter how many people agree to make that change, it doesn't change. And these are the things that we need to abide by, and we need to respect each other and, not lord over each other. We need to respect each other's individual sovereignty. I think that's what Josiah Warren was getting at. I think that's a pretty good place to end it for tonight. So anyways, guys, the chat's been really, really nice to me tonight. This was a nice live chat. Some friends in there. I got some friends in there tonight. That's great to see. Head on over to voluntaryistacademy.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Website's back up. Very proud of that. Thank you. Thank you for the, so much gratitude to the person that helped that happen. Really great. Sign up for the newsletter. Working on getting that back going. I'm pretty busy these days, but get you on the newsletter, get you up to date with what's going on. I'm working on it. Check out all the links in the show notes, and see if there's a way that perhaps if you found value out of this, maybe you can help me out and send a donation to keep the operation going and growing. That'd be cool too. We're going to keep going no matter what. I'll find a way to do it no matter what. But if you'd like to contribute, that'd be cool. And so without any further ado, yeah, that's going to be it for me tonight. Just remember one thing on your way out, that taxation is not only theft, it is slavery. And you, in fact, do own yourself. Period. Love you all. And I'll catch you next time. Peace.